Well, hello, hello, Committed 100. Glad you guys are with us. Glad you could join us as we continue our series on church history. I know many of you are still reeling from the 2-hour daylight earlier, but that's okay. Ka-chink, drinking their coffee. Hopefully you have your notebooks, your highlighters, your pens as we continue to look at church history and specifically the Council of Nicea. But before we do that, let me give you a peek outside. It's supposed to be like 102 or 104 today. Very interesting clouds with the chance of lightning and thunderstorms a little bit later. But a very nice day still to be in the office and getting things done here at church. Let me move this back so you guys should be able to hear me and the video. We're going to be looking at two videos from Dr. White concerning addressing objections raised by our Muslim and atheistic friends. Guten Tag, Michael. Glad you could join us. Of addressing objections by our atheistic, Muslim, and just friends that are mistaken about what actually happened at the Council of Nicea. This is an objection I get a lot. We're starting next week. We're actually going to be looking at the Nicene Creed and what was formulated at the end of the council. But so many people try and insert into the history around the Council of Nicea about what actually happened. Many times they will claim that at the Council of Nicea they put together the canon or the 66 books. That wasn't even on the agenda. The agenda was addressing the heresy going around at the time and formulating a statement of faith that solidified what they do believe and what they do not believe concerning Christ. Now, as we looked at the 20 canons last week from the Council of Nicea, not a single one of them was around the Bible and the canon of Scripture. It wasn't about rejecting certain quote-unquote gospels and accepting others. It was solely around what do we believe about Christ and what do we do with what we called the lapsi, those that had lapsed. Do we accept them? Do they retain their positions as pastors or bishops? Nothing in there about the canon, and yet this is what we're going to hear as common objections about the Trinity. Please let me know if you can hear the video. I think everything's set up for you guys to be able to hear it as we go through this video, which is approximately 30 minutes, and then another video that's 5 or 6 minutes long, and hearing the common objections specifically from Muslims, and they're many times just parroting what they've heard from other imams or other teachers and not doing their own research as to what actually happened in history.
Once again this morning I had the opportunity of listening to an Islamic presentation while I was riding. Ironically, what I listened to was a video. A friend of mine from Liberty University, not who you're thinking, converted one of Abdullah of London's videos into MP3 format. And since Abdullah uses a lot of text on the screen, he actually took the time to read what was on the screen so that once again I could use the many hours that I spend road riding as time of study. And it is an excellent time of study indeed. Anyway, as I listened to it, I once again was just so struck with the difference between the approach that we at Alpha and Omega Ministries attempt to take in speaking the truth in love and in showing honor to those, even with whom we disagree, by speaking the truth, by being consistent, by being accurate, by at least striving for it. We may not be perfect. We are fallen human beings, and we have our biases and prejudices too. And sometimes we just get our facts wrong. But we try, we seek to utilize the best information that we can find, things like that.
And with this comment, I would totally agree with Dr. White, is that nothing is gained by misrepresenting another person's position. That is why I personally spend time researching Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Islam, the Masonic Lodge, and accurately presenting their position so as to best refute it. It does no one good when you present falsehood or things out of context, such as this week, one of my church members posted a quote from Stephen Furtick. And in response, I shared my video on why Stephen Furtick is a heretic. I could only share that in full confidence in knowing that I've done the research, I've listened to the messages in context, and I've refuted thoroughly his false positions. In knowing that we've done the proper research and presented it accurately and not presenting what are called straw men, false positions that have no substance to them, that are easily lit aflame by truth, is the only place that we can go, is the only place that if we follow the one who is the truth, then we are going to present even our opponent's positions with truth.
Well, as I was listening, the subject of the Council of Nicea came up. And a number of years ago, I wrote an article for the CRI Journal, What Really Happened at the Council of Nicea.
Which, by the way, I've put a link to that article in the Committed 100 for you guys to read for yourself. An excellent article on really a great synopsis of what really happened at the Council of Nicea. Now, I do not advocate or promote CRI, especially since the main editors and contributors to the CRI have now gone into apostasy and on into the Orthodox Church, and have gone into mysticism and denying some essentials of the faith that they would have. Hank Hanegraaff would have said he agreed with years ago, but now has gone into apostasy. So it is what it is. But the article by Dr. White is very good that is on that site.
And I've heard many Muslims come up with just amazing assertions about what allegedly took place at the Council of Nicea. Now, back on June 19th on my blog, one of my fellow bloggers, Turretin fan, wrote an article about this very video that I'm going to be responding to here and showing you a major portion of. And so if you'd like to have a written response, you can go to the June 19th entry on the Prosopologion blog at aomin.org, and then you'll have the quotations and citations that are found there. And in fact, on some issues might go into more depth than I will in this video response. But I wanted to play a major portion of what was presented. There is one portion here, unfortunately. Well, the entire video is filled with mockery. And so I apologize to my Christian friends who might be offended by what they see. But I think it helps to recognize that when it's really untruth, it's untrue, it doesn't have any validity to it, that makes it a little bit easier to watch. But again, I don't think this is how we should approach interfaith dialogue to begin with. And I would hope for better from Abdullah and his friends Isa and others that are involved with him. So I want to play a section, and then I will start to respond back and forth as I present this video.
So before we get into the content of the video and the common objection by our Muslim, and often this is also the argument from our atheistic friends or non-Orthodox Christian friends, is the fact that Dr. White is trying to present this in a historical presentation. And yes, the phrase interfaith dialogue has become a loaded word. Dr. White and others have been maligned, and the understanding and the definition of interfaith dialogue has been watered down to much as now if you mention the word interfaith dialogue, it's as though you're wanting to get around a campfire and sing Kumbaya with these people, or that you're playing Pope Frankie and inviting imams into your church and letting them pray. No. That's not what the true meaning of interfaith dialogue is. Is in reality, when we have dialogues with those of other faiths, we are preaching to them the gospel, using apologetics to present them with truth. So don't let the phrase interfaith dialogue draw you off. There is no compromise in my presentation of the gospel or Dr. White's presentation of the gospel when we have a dialogue with someone who is maybe an agnostic or Muslim, is I'm not going to compromise on my position. But there's still a discussion that needs to take place. Also, by the way, if anyone can help me find this tie, it's a Koine Greek tie, and I cannot find it anywhere. And I would love to find out where to get a tie like it. I don't wear ties often, but when I do, I like a nice themed Bible tie. I've got 2 ties that have scripture verses on it, and one actually has different books of the Bible. I've been trying since yesterday to try and find this tie. So if someone can help me find this tie, I would be very appreciative. With that, let us listen to what Abdullah of London says, and I will repeat what Dr. White said. Much of this is going to be blasphemous, heretical. It makes fun of the Trinity, makes fun of the Lord. So if you're very sensitive to those things, just know that it's within the presentation by Abdullah of London. And we do not condone nor accept any of what's hereafter presented.
By the 4th century, it became necessary for the church to decide which of the many gospels that are in circulation were to be accepted as authentic. The question came up during the famous Council of Nicea.
Before Dr. White starts, no, it was not. How many times do I have to say this? I've said this a million times. Dr. White has said this a million times. Others, apologists, have said for years that no such discussion of the canon or accepted gospels occurred at the Council of Nicea. It had already been established by the beginning of the 2nd century as to the canon, with the exception of the book of Revelation, which was in question up until the middle of the 2nd century. But after that point, we have a canon. There was an accepted list of books. That is historical fact. What is being presented here is a common objection by our Muslim friends and others who are unwilling to actually read history and the eyewitness accounts of what actually happened and to accept it. They have to insert this assertion without any evidence.
I've said it before, I'll have to say it again. The Council of Nicea did not address the issue of the canon of the Scripture. There is not a single shred of contemporary or meaningful historical information to substantiate the assertion that the Council of Nicea addressed the issue of the canon. None. Zero. Zip and zilch. The only sources that these gentlemen are going to use, they stole from the theosophists of the 19th century.
I hope you guys heard that loud and clear. So they are using a quote-unquote historian, theosophist, of the 19th century, who's claiming to be a eyewitness of the Council of Nicea, to validate their claims that the discussion of the canon occurred at the Council of Nicea. It is ridiculous and dishonest to use sources and evidence in that way.
They do not use any contemporary historical information. They don't quote Eusebius. They don't quote anyone that has any meaningful connection to the Council of Nicea whatsoever. If we treated the Islamic sources the way that Abdullah of London and Isa and his friends address the Council of Nicea here, they would have every good reason to reject everything we have to say concerning their religion. So why do they feel that they have the right to engage in this kind of activity? I cannot begin to understand it, but once again, I call upon Abdullah, come up to a higher standard. Pull this kind of information. It is just so bad, it's just so wrong, historically speaking, that anyone who says they honor the truth should not engage in this kind of rhetoric.
Also, those that claim to represent this kind of truth also need to realize that even in the Quran it says that they are to deal with people on equal scales, to have scales of equality. The Bible says that the crooked scales are an abomination, so that we need to deal evenly, to have the same set of standards when evaluating Christianity as we do other religions. And the same needs to be for our Muslim and agnostic and other friends, to have the same set of standards, rather than having a hypocritical view that denies the fact of truth and history. If we were to do this with, let's say, looking at Darwin, and saying then that Neil T., the astronomer, in looking back at what Darwin presented, is an accurate eyewitness of Darwin being at the Galapagos Islands, and his research there is historically inaccurate. Darwin had been dead for at least 70 years before Neil T. was born. How could he have been an eyewitness? That same type of logic is being applied here by our Muslim and atheistic friends as in regards to the use of sources as to the Council of Nicea. It's inconsistent. It's ahistorical. It needs to stop.
The Council of Nicea was convened around 325 AD to settle the growing dispute about the nature of Jesus. The Roman Emperor Constantine convened this council to solve a problem that was threatening to rip Christianity apart. Although the emperor was pagan, he needed a new gimmick to unite the Roman Empire from being fractured and from splintering apart. Christianity seemed to be the ideal solution. But the only problem was that Christianity, in its pure monotheistic form, was totally different to pagan Roman religions that the citizens of Rome were used to. So it was in his interests to foresee the creation of a more Romanized Christianity that would appeal to Roman citizens and at the same time unite them behind one common religion and would unite them politically in one common identity. A few bishops and a significant majority of the Christian public believed Jesus to be purely human and a prophet of God.
Okay, a couple problems with this. There's no question about the political motivations of Constantine at this point, but the idea that he wanted to somehow change Christianity is a far leap from the recognition of the political nature of the beast. The idea that he wanted to create some new Christianity is, again, pure speculation without any type of meaningful historical foundation. Beyond this, we are just now told that some bishops and the majority of the people believe Jesus was merely a human prophet. This is pure absurdity. Not even the Arians believed that. The Arians believed that Jesus was the Son of God. They believed that he was divine, but they differentiated between Jesus and God on the level of being, in the sense of denying that his divinity was of the same nature as the Father's. He is a great creation and a divine being in that sense. He is not a mere Rasul. This is pure Islamic wishful thinking, read back into the history without the slightest bit of concern for context or truthfulness. I would challenge Abdullah and his friends, document this. Show it to us. It's interesting, just recently, a fresco was discovered, a mosaic was discovered in Megiddo. It may be one of the earliest Christian churches founded, long before the Council of Nicea. And on the floor, you have the specific reference to Jesus Christ as God in the exact same words that Ignatius uses in his epistles back in 107 AD. So the idea that this was a minority viewpoint or something like that, again, pure wishful thinking, stands completely against all of the documentation that serious individuals would be taking into account if they were seriously trying to address the subject of early Christian belief.
And specifically, if you notice in Abdullah of London's video, he quotes Matthew 18:18 and several other verses out of context to try and prove that Jesus was just a Rasul, a prophet of God, not fully God and fully man. And yet, any historical context of both the Gospels and of Jesus' full teaching is that Jesus taught that I and the Father are one, that he is not a creation, that he and the Father existed before the foundation of the world, that this concept that Islam is trying to read back into the early Christian centuries is unsupported by any history or the documents themselves. We take the earliest extra biblical documentation we have as we looked at the Didache. This was a common understanding within the first century that Jesus was fully God and fully man. The concept of the hypostatic union, that he wasn't a creation, that he always existed, that he is the Alpha and the Omega. So for our Muslim and atheistic and agnostic friends to assert that this was the majority view is factually inaccurate. And we need to continually challenge that because they need to provide sources. If you're going to say that within the first 3 centuries of the church that no one believed that Jesus was really God, that it was only a small minority, where's the evidence? Show me the proof. You can't just say something is true and not back it up, even with extra biblical accounts.
But the other bishops, like Athanasius, believed Jesus was divine.
Simple factual error. Athanasius was not a bishop at the Council of Nicea. Alexander of Alexandria was the bishop that represented Alexandria at the Council of Nicea. Athanasius was there, but he was merely a deacon. He was an assistant to Alexander. And it is pure supposition as to what Athanasius's role at the council actually was. There's no real evidence, contemporaneous evidence, of him taking a leading position or anything like that. But factual error here, Athanasius was not a bishop at the time of the Council of Nicea.
Once again, we're dealing with, if you are called to have equal scales, if you're to speak truthfully about what happened in history, then don't you think you should do your research as to what the eyewitness sources actually said about what happened at the Council of Nicea, and those that shortly after that knew those that were at the Council of Nicea wrote about those transactions, and then its effect on the remaining history of the Christian church. To read back on it, and from the Muslims' point of view, that Jesus is just a Rasul, a prophet, and then to try and go back into history and find those that agreed with you, and then say that that was the majority view, when in fact it was not, is dealing dishonestly with history. This happens with Dan Brown and his fictional series. This happens with agnostics and atheists in their continual presentations that are ahistorical, that they're not dealing with the right sources. With our Muslim friends, the same thing, like Abdullah of London. As Dr. White says, and I challenge them as well, come up to a higher standard of dealing with history, dealing with documentation, dealing with what people actually believe, rather than painting straw men or false presentations of what actually happened.
Fortunately, the two testimonies of eyewitnesses of the event have been preserved, so there can be little doubt as to the method used during the event in the selection of the Gospels. There were 318 bishops present in this council, and one of the two eyewitnesses, Sabinus, Bishop of Heraclea, left a description of their mental capabilities. With the exception of the emperor and Eusebius Paphilus, these bishops were a set of illiterate, simple creatures who understood nothing. Yet, it was this council of illiterate, simple-minded creatures who decided the fate of Christian doctrine for the next 1,700 years. And in the end, they submitted the issue of Jesus' divinity to a vote. After much pressuring from Athanasius, the pro-divinity group won by majority vote.
Once again, pure historical fiction being presented as if it was fact. Once again, there is no contemporaneous evidence that Athanasius was putting pressure on anyone at all. There's no evidence Sabinus was an eyewitness. In fact, if some of the information is correct, he flourished around 425, which would mean he was maybe a baby at that point in time at best. His writings are from 375, so there is no evidence that he actually was at all at the Council of Nicea. He was not an eyewitness. If you think he was, prove it. And furthermore, even his very biased history that comes from many years after the council was criticized heavily at the time that it was actually written by his contemporaries because of its bias and its inaccuracy. And so to take his dislike of these council fathers and to expand that into some kind of an established demonstration that everyone at the Council of Nicea were a bunch of illiterates is, again, not only ridiculous, but it's also extremely offensive. If someone did this about the companions of Muhammad, people would be dying in the streets. But Muslims seem to be able to use singular sources, ignore the contemporaneous sources, and think they can get away with it. The reality is that many of these bishops came to the Council of Nicaea bearing the scars that they had earned as people who had suffered for the name of Christ. Because serious students of history, those who actually are concerned about truth, know the fact that it had only been 12 years since the peace of the church in 313. And that meant that there had, up till 313, been the most severe imperial persecution of Christians. The worst persecution of Christians was at the very end of the period of imperial persecution, beginning with Nero, and then becoming very heavy from 250, 260 until the peace of the church in 313. There were men at that council missing limbs, bearing scars from the torture that they endured for their faith in Christ. The idea that these men were a bunch of illiterates is not only offensive, it's simply foolish. No serious person dealing with truth would make these kinds of statements. What is more, the idea that someone could force upon them a religion that they had never even thought of before, when they would not renounce Christ at the tip of a sword only 12 or 15 years earlier, is likewise utterly absurd. It destroys the credibility of people to use this kind of argumentation. I don't know why they don't see that. It certainly, for me, convinces me that these individuals are not trying to convert me. They're not interested in my coming to know anything about Islam, because you don't misrepresent someone else's faith and the history of someone else's faith in the process of trying to bring them to the truth. And so this kind of rhetoric, this kind of mockery which we're about to see, is founded, as we have now seen, upon so much falsehood, such simple error of fact, again reflects, I think, greatly upon the nature of Islamic apologetics today.
So you notice there what Dr. White said, something that is important when we discuss the Council of Nicea. Why would those that could have easily done the pinch of incense and said, Kaiser Kurias, those that could have handed over their scriptures, those that could have received their libellus, their certificate, easily by dishonesty, then just maybe 2 decades later, when the peace of the church comes, then say, well, we really didn't believe that anyways, is ridiculous. We couldn't, as Dr. White says, get away with saying the same types of things about the companions of Muhammad and saying that they were a bunch of barbarians and illiterates who couldn't even remember the oral traditions as passed down to them by Muhammad. That would be insulting, and it would be historically inaccurate. We know from history that many of the companions of Muhammad had memorized the entire Quran, and they carried down to us in what's called isnad chains of the oral traditions and the collections that come to us much later. Once again, are there equal scales being used here? If we were to say that about Islam, we would be labeled as bigots and other names. And as Dr. rightly says, there would be riots in the street. And yet when they do the same thing with the Council of Nicea, and they don't expect us to challenge these assertions without asking for proper evidence and equal scales. before Dr. White gets back on there, look at this last slide by Abdullah of London. Join the Pauline party and change your faith today. There is a lot of anti-Pauline sentiment and a lot of misunderstanding of the history of Paul's conversion, because the Muslims understand, and rightly so, that if you remove Paul from the New Testament, that a lot of the strong Christological pictures in the New Testament then go away. Now, we do pick them back up in 1 John, but then again, there's also anti-First John sentiments in Islam. So they understand rightly where to pick their battles, and there will be a lot of discussion between Muslims and Christians as to the nature of Paul and his theology. And we're not going to see that in this presentation, but we will see it yet future when we deal with Islam and as to the nature of the New Testament scriptures. But you notice there the objection here in this blasphemous presentation of, well, if you want a God you can see, just vote for Jesus. The big problem is when you deal with history, they're rejecting the fact that from the very beginning, from the disciples of John, who they in turn wrote high Christological defenses of the faith in fighting against the Gnostics, that they believed all the things that were ratified at the Council of Nicea 200 years before. Once again, I'll say that again. Those that were apostles of John and ended up becoming bishops of the church, and those that were disciples of Paul, held high Christological doctrines 200 years before the Council of Nicea. To say that the Council of Nicea then presents the first minority view of the doctrine of Christ is foolish at best. Show me any early church father, pre-Nicene father, that would have denied the presentation that it was ratified and put into a creedal form at the Council of Nicea. Evidence, folks.
Once again, I apologize for that, but I think we need to understand exactly how Muslims think the deity of Christ is defined and defended. I've written an entire book on the doctrine of the Trinity, presented a great deal of biblical evidence on that particular subject of.
I wish my books weren't actually in boxes since they're working on my new office. But if you guys, as we're going through systematic theology and we've been looking at the doctrine of the Trinity, Dr. White's book on the Forgotten Trinity is one of the best modern resources on the doctrine of the Trinity. It's not only its foundation, but its formation in history is an excellent resource. And in fact, it's been recently updated, not with just new cover, but with new expansion of material and discussion of passages, not only in the Bible, but looking at the true history of the Council of Nicea. It's an excellent resource to get a hold of.
Defended that a number of times, of course, and so a serious Christian looks at this and is simply offended, doesn't want anything to do with this is Islam. I don't want it. And again, that makes me wonder why the Muslims produce that kind of stuff. But just another historical fact, there were 2 of the bishops who didn't sign the creed, and that's not where the belief in the deity of Christ comes from in the first place.
So Dr. White mentions there that there are 2 bishops. Out of the 318, 2 didn't sign. Why is that? Well, they were the 2 bishops that were delegated by Arius. Once again, go back in history. What is the Council of Nicea dealing with? It's dealing with the Arian heresy. as to the presentation of Jesus as God, but of a different substance, a different type of God than the Father. So Arius didn't show up to the council, but he delegated 2 of bishops that were underneath his control, so to speak, to be his representatives. Those 2 bishops didn't sign the following creed that the rest of the bishops that were present did. So once again, this is important to look at history in context. So yes, it was the majority view and the majority vote. It was a minority view and the minority dissension that yes, Jesus is the same substance as the Father.
Because if these gentlemen would read a meaningful history of the Christian faith, they would know that for the next more than 40 years, it was the Arians who held sway in the Roman Empire. Sometime around 350-ish or so, Jerome, looking back at it, made the commentary that the world woke up and was amazed to find itself Arian. Athanasius himself was driven out of his church 5 times for refusing to give up on his belief in the deity of Christ. This thing about Paulians and Pauline Christianity. Again, to the serious historian, you just go, what are these people talking about? But Muslims are willing to grab hold of any kind of argumentation. In an earlier part of this video, in an earlier part, a portion of it, segment, they're citing, and not really understanding what they're saying, but they're citing liberals. Now, these same individuals, I'm sure, do not cite Ibn Warwick and atheists or liberals who address the subject of the Quran. I'm sure that they are not utilizing that kind of information. Once again, the stark reality that the Muslim wears one garb when speaking of Muhammad and the history of Islam and their sacred text, the Quran, and then tears that garb off and puts on the garb of the ultra-liberal, the atheist, to address the New Testament and the history of Christianity. That epistemological schizophrenia is, to me, the greatest evidence of the error, the falsehood of Islam. I have not met, not yet. Got a number of debates coming up real soon. Maybe I'll meet one. But I have yet to meet the consistent Muslim. I have yet to meet the Muslim who remains a Muslim when attacking the New Testament. Haven't met one. I'll let you know if I do.
Dr. White brings up a great point here, is that Muslims claim to be very conservative in their views of the inspiration of the Quran and its being preserved. And yet then when they attack the New Testament, as Dr. White clearly points out, that they then put on a robe of skepticism and liberalism, willing to quote sources they would never in turn quote when examining the Quran. Once again, where's the even scales, as the Quran says? Where's the even scales, as the New Testament says? Where is this equality when saying, let us reason together? Reason means that you're on the same wavelength and the same scales, and you're finding out the truth. Where is that? When you see Dan Brown misquoting the Council of Nicea, you see Abdullah of London here misquoting the Council of Nicea. And speaking of which, welcome Malcolm and Pastor X. Glad you guys could join us as we're talking about what really happened at the Council of Nicea and what skeptics and critics of Christianity say about what happened at the Council of Nicea and presenting the truth.
Although the main issue was to discuss the nature of Christ, the arguments for and against his divinity were based upon the 40 to 100 or so Gospels that the council members brought with them from their respective areas. 4,200
Gospels. I don't even know how to start to respond to something like this that is just so far removed from reality. There is not a single shred of historical evidence, none whatsoever, nothing that could even begin to substantiate such an absurd statement as this. None. The wildest liberal, the wildest atheist can only look at that kind of claim with stunned shock. It would be like me saying, well, actually, scholars say that the Quran was written by 3,000 different individuals over the course of 400 years. I'm sorry, but it is extremely difficult to take someone seriously who will, with a straight face, utter something as absurd as this. And you say, well, absurd is a strong word. Well, when you're making things up on the fly, yes, it's a strong word. Even in just a moment, he's going to say that they submitted 40 Gospels to the council. The Council of Nicea said and did nothing about the canon. There is no evidence for any of this. It's all lies. Prove it. Show us documentation. Go to meaningful sources, not theosophists who get seances in the 19th century. Okay? That's not history, folks. Prove it. Document it. You know, here. This is called documentation. Here is the text of the earliest New Testament Greek manuscripts. Here you will find the text of each of the papyri manuscripts. This is called documentation. This is the serious stuff. Let me show you something else. I'm not even going to move the camera. Here. This is what's called documentation. Okay? See that? This is a facsimile. Costs hundreds and hundreds of dollars of the earliest manuscripts of the Quran. From Paris, from London. This is called getting documentation. Doing things seriously. Making things up on the fly. Finding absurd stuff from somebody on drugs on the internet is not serious discussion about religious issues. It shows no respect, gentlemen, for those you are seeking to try to bring into Islam to post this kind of information. None. There were not 40 Gospels submitted to the Council of Nicea. They did not bring 4,200 Gospels with them. This is all absurdity on the highest level. And those interested in truth should, if they're consistent, remove this kind of information. Other Muslims who are concerned should write to them and suggest they check their facts. And if they can't back it up, they need to withdraw it. And there's one thing is for certain. That kind of claim is so absurd, it would have to be withdrawn.
And Dr. White nails it on the head. Once again, the unequal scales and the absurdity what's presented. Number one, Council of Nicea didn't deal with the canon. And if we are to look at that period of time, and I'm not talking about the pseudoparagraph that comes just 50 years later, that even at the earliest, if we're looking at 325, the earliest Gnostic Gospels that they would have had access to, if even presented at the Council of Nicea, would have been a handful. The rest of the Proto-Gnostic and the Gnostic Gospels that were dealt with were written much later. Most of the Gnostic Gospels in which we deal with today, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, were written hundreds of years after the Council of Nicea. So to say that there were 4,500 Gospels presented, and to say that the 50 Gospels were presented as authentic to the Council of Nicea, the best way to put it is a lie. Show me a single historical source. Not, as Dr. White says, not someone who was born 1800 years later, 1600 years later. Show me someone contemporary. Show me Eusebius. Show me Ignatius. Show me Polycarp. Show me anybody that presents these as authentic. Hey, Pastor, that's good. Glad you could join us. Where's the documentation? Where are the sources? They're not there. And to make stuff, as Dr. White says, on the fly is disingenuous at best.
So the issue over which Gospels are fully authentic and which are not had to be dealt with there and then in order for an agreement to be reached on which is to be used as a source for argumentation. About 40 Gospels were submitted to these bishops in total. As they differed widely in their contents, the decision was very difficult as to which one to choose. At last, it was determined to resort to divine intervention.
You notice there, in the listing of some of these Gospels presented supposedly at the Council of Nicea, included the Hebrews, included Pauline letters. You see the virulent anti-Pauline bent of Islam. You see this super hatred towards Paul in Islam that we will deal with at another time. But then you see these listings of Gospels, as I already said, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Thomas, weren't even written, weren't even around at the Council of Nicea, that were pseudepigraphia, assumed names writing these things hundreds of years later. So to say that these Gospels were even discussed at the Council of Nicea when they hadn't been written yet is factually inaccurate.
The method used was known as a sortes sanctorum, or the holy casting of lots for the purposes of divination.
He's inserting later Roman Catholic categories that would be proven in the different Vatican councils and the quote-unquote later Catholic councils on the Council of Nicea. If someone ends up watching this, prove documentation that they used this form of divination in their voting for the decrees of the council. Show me from an eyewitness that this is the process by which they came up to the creed or the canons of the council.
Its use in the Council of Nicea was described by another eyewitness, Pappus, in his book the Synodicon to the Council of Nicea. He says, having promiscuously put all the Gospels referred to the council for determination under the communion table in a church, they besought the Lord that the inspired writings might get upon the table while the spurious ones remained underneath, and it happened accordingly. So then, when the church fathers came back the next morning, they found 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, on the table. Funnily enough, no one ever asked if there happened to be a spare key to that chamber, but I guess we'll never know. I mean, there has to be some reason those Gospels got on the table. I mean, they couldn't have just teleported there or something.
Energizing.
The case is that the church was practicing divination to pick its word of God.
And I'm so happy for that reason, because I know, therefore, I can trust it. I can trust the 27 books that are there. More than that, we know that when they were chosen for a purpose. I trust them. I hope you do as well. This is Jake.
History is funny, isn't it? What modern-day Christians swear by, testify to, and even kill for was in reality just a bunch of books selected using under-the-table shenanigans. Which I find very hypocritical, because the church condemned thousands of unfortunate victims as conjurers, enchanters, magicians, witches, and in league with demons, those who practiced divination, and burned them by the thousands.
Well, you have to give the young men some credit for imagination, but given that they're willing to mock the Christian faith based upon their research, notice that they said there were 2 eyewitnesses. Sebenus, which we've discovered there's no evidence that he was, and that if he was, he would have been like a baby and lived over 100. And then we have this Pappus, who gives us this story. Again, by the way, you'll find this in Theosophist writings of the 19th and 20th centuries, which seems to be exactly where they stole it from. But Pappus is an eyewitness. Well, that's interesting, because if they had taken the time to check their sources, which clearly they did not, they would find out that Pappus's book that they're quoting from actually contains material about numerous councils. In fact, the last council it contains information about was from just before the year 900, which would mean that Pappus would have lived to about 600 years of age. That makes about as much sense as my saying John Calvin was there when the Quran was revealed. Yeah, it's about the same problem there. This kind of utter absurdity, presented as if it's fact, is just simply reprehensible. There is no reason to do this kind of thing. I certainly hope that Abdullah and Isa and his friends don't really believe this stuff. Do you? I mean, this is just so fantastic, so ahistorical, so ridiculous that it's really hard to believe that this isn't being presented as a joke, as something that's just meant to make us all chuckle. And if that was somewhere on the website, I'm sorry if I missed it, but I don't think it's there. I think these young men are demonstrating that many Muslims today are willing to grab hold of anything, no matter how outrageous it is, and how completely outside the realm of anything they'd accept about their own religion. I mean, look at what has happened here. This kind of stuff is put on YouTube, and no one complains. In a debate, I mention an Islamic tradition about Ibn Masud's death by being beaten for not giving up his Quran, and all of a sudden I'm a terrible, horrible deceiver. You put stuff on YouTube that is absolutely beyond absurd, and all is well. Double standard. Hypocrisy. What does that say about our relative positions? What does that say about truth? I hope you'll think about these things, and I would invite Abdullah and Isa and his friends to withdraw those videos that have been demonstrated to simply be based upon pure fiction, absolute fiction that has no connection whatsoever with reality. Thanks for watching.
So once again, they're quoting this Pappus, and maybe they're mixing up. There's a Pappus in the 4th century, but he was a mathematician, not a theologian, nor a historian. Maybe they're mixing up with the Pappus of Strasbourg, who lived 1549 to 610. Let's see, that's 1,200 years after the Council of Nicea. Which is which? Once again, as Dr. White clearly says, It's almost like they're grasping at straws for any little bit from anyone, any source, to insert their assertion that the canon of Scripture was concluded at the Council of Nicea. Didn't happen. And to say that it did is dishonest, disingenuous, and not dealing with history. We couldn't get away with the same type of assertions when talking about the history of the Quran, or Jewish history, or any other legitimate historical endeavor, and yet they then choose to pick and choose these odd resources when trying to tear apart the history of the Bible. As Dr. White said earlier, come up to a higher standard. Get your timeline straight about whether the papas of the Reformation period, or the papist, the mathematician during the 4th century. Get the papist right. With that, I will leave it for today. Next week we will look at another couple of videos regarding the Council of Nicea and common objections that are brought up by people like Dan Brown and our Muslim friends in dealing with what actually happened at the Council of Nicea. I hope you guys take the time to read Dr. White's article that I posted in the Committed 100. Also, that if you guys have time, take a look at the new Committed 100 website, thecommitted100.com. And if you guys have time, write a little testimonial for those that are not currently a part of the Committed 100 to see the value and to see the edification that comes in and through the group. I'm glad to see Pastor Thatch, Pastor Eck, Michael, and others being able to join us in our discussion today. May the Lord bless you. May He keep you. May His face shine upon you and give you rest this week as you seek to serve Him.